In August 1914, at the outbreak of the Great War in Europe, aircraft did not enter into the plans of the belligerents. The frontline troops of all the nations, slaughtering one another on the far-flung battlefields, counted in the millions. The number of total aircraft deployed by the combatants amounted to a little over 500 fragile, unarmed monoplanes, biplanes, and triplanes. Those early military pilots who were flying over the trenches of the Western Front were essentially aerial chauffeurs. Their job was to ferry an observer over the countryside to report on troop movements. In the first months of the war, there was plenty to observe with the Germans overrunning Belgium and advancing on Paris.
A circular came round all cavalry divisions asking for lightweight, specified lightweight officers to volunteer to become observers.
The Royal Flying Corps was a very exclusive corps that frightfully hand-picked people in it, and the only people who could get into the Royal Flying Corps were people who were seconded from the regular regiments, and not only that, from the better class of the regular regiments. And so that was that. But I did pick up from the chap. Did I know anything about airplanes? I had to admit that I didn't. If I had known something about airplanes, they might have had two thoughts about it.
In those days, unless you were an officer, you weren't supposed to have sufficient brains to be capable of flying. It was sort of a closed shop, because it was only the officer class who could pay for his private tuition and civil life. It was simply a question of class.
In the east, German aviators located the advancing Russian army, allowing field commanders to move troops where they were most needed, and giving the outnumbered Germans an epic victory at Tannenberg. In the west, French aircraft returned to their bases to report that the enemy's armies had made a fatal mistake and exposed their flank. This bit of intelligence allowed the French to turn the tide and doom Europe to 4 long years of trench warfare. In 1915, photography replaced sketches and handwritten notes as a technique for aerial reconnaissance. Aircraft with pilot observers equipped with unwieldy box cameras were sent out day after day over the front to take photographs of the endless trenches and gun emplacements. With freezing fingers, observers hung over the sides of their ships in gale-like slipstreams to get a picture of an enemy below. The job was unglamorous and dangerous.
The cavalry tended to be jealous of a new arm that might detract from their reconnaissance potential. I was moving away from an arm which was obviously having minimal active service, and that under conditions of gross discomfort.
The aircraft had to fly straight and steady, making it an inviting target from ground fire and eventually armed aircraft.
I wonder how long my nerves will stand this daily ground fire. I would not mind it so much if I were in a machine that was fast and that would climb a little more willingly. Well, I suppose the end will be pretty sharp and quick. Lieutenant William Reed, Royal Flying Corps.
In addition to observation, early warbirds began to drop small bombs on the enemy. At first, the bombs were nothing more than hand grenades and converted artillery shells, but soon this was refined to projectiles capable of destroying factories and railroads. By 1917, sturdier specialized bombers began to appear with bomb racks and bomb sights. Raids were carried out in daylight when air superiority allowed it, and at night when it did not. By the end of the war, aircraft roamed the front, bombing bridges and airfields and strafing troops, proving that the airplane had made the battlefield three-dimensional. The third use of the airplane in war was that of an attack aircraft. For the generals, the only reason to place guns on an airplane was to protect the reconnaissance aircraft. But for the pilots and observers, it was a means to have a go at the other fellow. The first recorded aerial victory occurred on October 5, 1914, when a French pusher aircraft downed a German aviatique. For the most part, firing pistols and flares had limited effect on a foe traveling at 90 miles an hour. Mounting machine guns on the aircraft would change all that. Dutch designer Anthony Fokker made aerial combat possible when he created a propeller interrupter that allowed a forward-mounted machine gun to be placed on a German Eindecker monoplane, thus creating the first true fighter plane. It was so effective and took such a horrific toll on Allied aircraft that the British called it the Fokker Scourge. By 1916, fighter planes were being grouped in squadrons as tactics were developed for fighting formations, and a new breed of warrior was born. The fighter pilot. When Germany developed its first true fighter plane, it was logical that they would put the controls in the hands of the fatherland's best pilots. Max Immelmann and Oswald Bölker, as members of Flight Section 62, were among the first pilots to receive the Fokker Eindecker, and they used it to deadly effect. The great Max Immelmann's legend was confused and contradictory even during the war. A fierce fighter pilot, dubbed the Eagle of Lille by his opponents, he was a mama's boy whose mother regularly sent him chocolates. Even his death remains clouded in conflict and self-serving claims. When the war broke out in 1914, 24-year-old Max requested the aviation service. His record as a pilot trainee is unclear. Some sources say he was a poor student. Others describe him as a natural. Initially, he flew the mail and supplies to the German aerodromes, but was soon assigned to piloting photo reconnaissance. But when the Eindecker reached the front, Immelmann and fellow pilot Oswald Bölker were given a chance with the revolutionary new weapons. On August 1, 10 British BE-2Cs bombed the Douai aerodrome. Bölker and Immelmann went after the departing Englishman, but Bölker's gun jammed after he'd fired a few rounds. He landed to fix it and saw Immelmann attack the BE-2s. Immelmann put his fragile aircraft into a dive and fired first at one plane and then another. One started into a steep glide, and Immelmann tailed it all the way to the ground. His gunfire had broken the pilot's elbow and forced him to land. On the ground, Immelmann approached the British pilot. They shook hands, and Immelmann informed the Englishman that he was a prisoner. For this exploit, Max received the Iron Cross First Class. In the fall of 1915, Immelmann and Bölker continued to carry on a friendly rivalry, matching one another victory for victory. Neither was a fancy flyer. Immelmann wrote, "I do not employ tricks when I attack." On January 12, 1916, Immelmann and Bölker both scored their 8th victories, prompting their decoration with the Blue Max. On June 18, Immelmann engaged the FE-2Bs of RFC Squadron 25. According to British accounts, gunfire from an FE-2 piloted by Lieutenant G.R. McCubbin and gunned by Corporal J.H. Waller hit Immelmann's Fokker, and it spiraled into the ground. Perhaps the notion that a lowly two-seater FE-2 had brought down their leading ace, the Germans announced that he had been downed by anti-aircraft fire. This explanation also suited Tony Fokker, who filed a report noting that the fuselage had been shot in two by shrapnel fire. Other sources, including Max's brother Franz, blamed the interrupter gear and claimed that amongst the wreckage, his propeller had been found, shot away right in line with his own guns. Most authorities concur with this explanation, but like so many events of World War I's aerial combat, the death of Max Immelmann remains obscured by conflicting reports and uncertainty. Immelmann's squadron mate, Oswald Bölker, is considered to be the father of the dogfight. Boelcke envisioned the grouping of hand-picked pilots in fighter squadrons, or Jagdstaffel. Boelcke was born in 1891, son of a schoolteacher in Halle, Germany. Both studious and athletic as a youth, Oswald excelled at mathematics and physics and also took up swimming, tennis, rowing, and gymnastics. Imbued with German nationalism and militarism from his father, at the age of 13, young Oswald took the outrageous step of writing Kaiser Wilhelm directly for an appointment to military school. He joined the military and at Darmstadt first encountered the aviation branch, which he joined as an NCO pilot. His older brother Wilhelm also joined the aviation service as an NCO observer. In those days, observers had more status than pilots, who were likened to mere chauffeurs. Both were decorated in the first year of the war. In early 1915, Oswald Boelcke was assigned to the newly formed Aviation Section 62 at Döberitz. It was here that Tony Fokker first demonstrated his E-1 Eindecker monoplane equipped with a fixed Spandau machine gun. While flying the Fokker monoplane, Boelcke downed 5 enemy aircraft by the end of 1915. By August of 1916, the good times were over for the German pilots. The Fokker scourge no longer dominated the skies over the Western Front. The streamlined French Nieuport 11 and the British Pusher biplanes were giving the Germans trouble, and Boelcke began to focus on tactics to counter them, accurate gunnery, tight formations, and staying within the German lines. In September 1916, Boelcke's dream of a superstar squadron was granted. He was given command of a new fighter squadron, Jasta II. Even while assuming new administrative duties, Boelcke shot down 11 British planes in September. As the leader of Jasta II, he passed his knowledge on to many of Germany's greatest flyers, including Manfred von Richthofen. Boelcke and his pilots used numbers and tactics rather than individual skill to overwhelm their foes. Jasta II only flew in large, well-organized formations, dubbed circuses. Any Allied plane that came within their section of the sky was doomed. Boelcke cared little for his personal record. What he cared about was making sure his young pilots got the enemy in their gun sights and came home alive. Boelcke set down his principles for combat known as Boelcke's Dicta. He taught that pilots should attack from behind and out of the sun, fire only at close range, and when attacked from above, turn and face the enemy. In the fall of 1916, he shot down 21 Allied aircraft in 2 months, increasing his total to 40. But like Immelmann before him, his luck ran out on October 28, 1916. During a fierce dogfight, he collided with another German aircraft and spiraled to his death. In a gesture from another era, British flyers honored their downed enemy by dropping a wreath at his burial site, inscribed to the memory of Captain Boelcke, our brave and chivalrous foe. These young men were part of a rare breed, soldiers in history's bloodiest war, who fought one-on-one far above the stench and carnage in the trenches below. Britain's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, told a wartime audience that airmen were the knighthood of the war, without fear and without reproach. That sense of chivalry was summed up by one British flyer in a letter home.
I hate to shoot a Hun down without him seeing me. Although this method is in accordance with my doctrine, it is against what little sporting instincts I have left. James McCudden, Royal Flying Corps.
But not all aces spent time looking for skilled opponents. Edward Manock once chanced upon 6 German aircraft on a training flight. He shot down the instructor and then picked off the 5 defenseless students one by one. There were many brave aces on both sides during the Great War, but the greatest hunter of the skies was a charming and humorous Prussian known by his admiring foes simply as the Red Baron.
Fight on and fly, on to the last drop of blood and the last drop of fuel, to the last beat of the heart. Manfred von Richthofen.
Baron Manfred von Richthofen transferred from the Prussian cavalry to the air service in 1915. Having flown as an observer and a bomber pilot in the East, he was chosen by Boelcke to join his Jasta in France. Eventually, he was given command of Jasta 11. Because of its garishly colored machines, the British soon christened the unit Richthofen's Flying Circus. Having survived a head wound during a dogfight in July 1917, Richthofen was pressured by his superiors to withdraw from combat. The High Command had reason to be concerned about their heroic ace. The young Baron was so beloved by the German people that it was felt by the Kaiser that his death would be a crushing blow to German morale. In spite of this concern, during the 1918 spring offensive, he climbed back into the cockpit to lead his men into battle. On April 21, the Red Baron's luck ran out. He was shot through the heart while pursuing a British Sopwith flying low behind Allied lines. Whether he was shot by an Australian machine gun or Canadian Roy Brown is still debated. His bright red triplane came down behind British lines. Richthofen's body was removed from the cockpit and buried with full military honors by the enemy he terrorized. His final victory total was 80 Allied aircraft destroyed. No other pilot would reach that total until World War II. No non-German has come close to that total even today. The best fighter pilots on both sides were far from immune from the pressure of the war. Before they died, and most of them did die, many were exhausted from too many hours in the air. Many drove themselves beyond human limits. The great French ace Guynemer feared that if he withdrew from combat, people would say it was because he had won all the awards. He was unfit, physically ill, racked by paranoia and insomnia, yet he died while flying. Like a fabled warrior legend, Guynemer would vanish on a mission, not a trace of him or the aircraft ever to be found. A few aces died a hero's death. One of them was German ace Werner Voss. On September 23, 1917, Voss, flying alone in his pale blue Fokker, was attacked by an entire flight of SE-5s led by British ace James McCudden. As the SE-5s dived, he spun on his tail to face them.
By now, the German triplane was in the middle of our formation, and its handling was wonderful to behold. The pilot seemed to be firing at all of us simultaneously, and although I got behind him a second time, I could hardly hold him in my sights. James McCudden, British Royal Flying Corps.
2 British machines went down in the fight. Then the Germans' luck ran out. Arthur Davids latched onto his tail and racked the triplane with repeated bursts of fire. The aircraft hit the ground and disappeared into 1,000 pieces. No matter how they died, to a generation, they were the equivalent of the Knights of the Round Table.
How you gonna keep them down on the farm of the St. Paris?
In 1917, as America prepared to enter the Great War, U.S. air power ranked just 14th in the world. America's only trained combat aviators were those flying in France with the famous Lafayette Escadrille. The Lafayette Squadron was formed in April 1916 when American Norman Prince and a group of 7 others were allowed to form a squadron in hopes that it would encourage the United States to enter the war. The American Volunteers were a devil-may-care group that included Ivy League football players, Southwestern cowboys, and even the son of a former president of the United States. Though they fought bravely, they could not compete with Germany, whose air force dominated the skies over Europe's battlefields. By June, they were thrown into the fighting over the battle at Verdun. Flying 5 patrols a day, all 7 of the original pilots were either killed or wounded by the end of the month. Almost a year after the United States entered the war, the Lafayette Squadron was integrated into the U.S. Army Air Service. Other American pilots serving with the French were also invited to transfer to American units, with the exception of Eugene Jacques Bullard, who was passed over because he was black. In the air as on the ground, the U.S. was hardly ready to fight a world war.
Believe me, we were far from ready. I was a rookie cadet, I ought to know. They gave us wooden guns and told us we were going to turn the tide. For training equipment, we molded our own bombs out of plaster. Pretty soon we trained with the real things, and having met the ground training requirements, we were issued leather flying togs and helmets. It was a proud day. First, we made a pre-flight check of our bailing wire planes. Then we tried out our wings. 50 hours in the air, a few bombs, and we were ready for advanced training overseas.
America was producing airmen, but it still didn't have a single fighting aircraft. Soon voices began to be raised in Washington advocating the development of U.S. Army air power. Newton Backer, Secretary of War, insisted supremacy of the air in modern warfare is essential. President Woodrow Wilson proposed $600 million to meet the needs of military aviation, and while Congress debated his request, the newly minted pilots were dispatched over there. Though they went without aeroplanes, they did go in style. Camouflaged luxury liners like the Leviathan were used as troop ships.
Most of us, half-trained but eager to fight, went to France. There we found cities of wooden barracks and muddy streets. In outdoor classes, we practiced gunnery. Wooden models taught us how to lead an airplane with our fire. Battle-tested aviators took time out from the war to show us how to handle a stick. It was much easier to talk about turning the tide than to produce fighting aces overnight.
Late in 1917, the 1st Aero Squadron was formed under the command of Major Ralph Royce. Royce's men were the first all-American aviation unit to see combat action. They were young and untested, but they did not lack for daring. They proudly pasted paper iron crosses over the enemy bullet holes in their aircraft and showed their American pride with their Uncle Sam hat-in-the-ring fuselage artwork. When Major William Thor and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumphs and much-needed experience to the American Air Service. Along with him came Captain Field Kindley, who shot down 12 enemy planes, as did Captain Elliott Springs with 9 kills. One of the old hands in the young American service was Major Raoul Lufbery, who had 17 enemy kills. Lufbery was born in France, but moved to the U.S. at the age of 19. When war broke out, he enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. In May 1916, he joined the Lafayette Escadrille. He soon became its leading ace. In 1918, he joined the U.S. Army Air Service as a combat instructor. He was killed in May 1918 after rushing to the aid of an inexperienced pilot. Racked by machine gun fire, Lufbery's Newport caught on fire in sight of his airfield, and with the rest of the squadron watching, he jumped to his death rather than burn alive. The ace of American aces was former race car driver Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who ran up an amazing 26 kills in air combat. The rough-talking Captain Eddie had an all-business approach to aerial combat.
Fighting in the air is not sport. It's scientific murder. Captain Edward Rickenbacker, U.S. Army Air Service.
As the young Yanks took to the sky and borrowed French Nieuports, and if they were lucky, a few worn-out SPAD 13s, the country that first took to the skies struggled to catch up with an American warbird of its own.
America's airplane factories and us war workers didn't get started until late. To make airplane wings, they took house carpenters, furniture upholsterers, even seamstresses. Painters used varnish that smelled like bananas. After each plane was test flown, we tore it down for packing, under guard. Then, crated and addressed, it was sent off to the front.
In May 1918, the first American DH-4s were shipped in pieces from American factories to France, where parts were reassembled into the fighting craft which helped sweep the enemy out of the sky. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators, ready for the big push. Even before the Great War, the airship was fixed in the minds of the public as a symbol of terror. As early as 1908, H.G. Wells had described an airship raid on New York that left that city in ruins and blazing conflagrations and heaped and scattered dead. It was a vision that did not go unnoticed by some military commanders. Captain Peter Strasser, head of the German Navy's airship fleet, believed that Britain could be overcome by means of airships. The Germans had no monopoly on the intent to bomb enemy cities and industrial centers. But they did have the lead in airship technology, and in 1914, airships were the only aircraft capable of carrying large bomb loads far enough to strike strategic targets. However, at this stage of the war, no nation's air service was capable of fulfilling Wells' vision of aerial destruction. Metal-framed Zeppelins and plywood-framed Schutzlanzes revealed serious drawbacks in combat, but they could not survive over the battlefield. Traveling at under 50 miles per hour, they present large, tempting targets for gunners on the ground and nimble fighters in the air. 4 huge airships were shot down in the first month of the war. The one weapon the airship had in its favor was stealth. On a moonless night, despite the bulk, Zeppelins could evade detection and pursuit. The great airships became night raiders. The Imperial German Army and Navy used airships to bomb a variety of strategic targets under the cover of darkness, including Paris. But the most prized target was London. German schoolchildren learned to sing, "Zeppelin, fly, fly to England, England will burn in fire." The arrival of airships over Britain in 1915 made a deep impression on the helpless civilian population. None who heard the thumping of the Maybach engines or witnessed the dark silhouette passing overhead in the night ever forgot the experience. Yet airship commanders found mounting a sustained campaign risky. Flying from bases in the north of Germany or occupied Belgium to Britain and back in pitch darkness was a dangerous task. Once Britain deployed night fighters and ground batteries armed with incendiary ammunition, travel to London under the vast gas bags seemed like a very bad idea. The first airship raids over Britain began in January 1915, and the first raid on London the following May. Although sporadic, the raids were successful. Not only did the raids destroy a fair number of war supplies and cost many lives, they also forced the British to divert valuable resources of aircraft and men from the Western Front. In late 1916, the Germans launched the most ambitious airship bombing offensive of the war. It was a disaster. Waiting for the German airships was the Home Defense Wing flying BE-2C biplanes. When an airship raid was detected, they took off from airstrips lit by flares. Once in the air, they relied on the faintly visible line of the horizon to keep their sense of balance and hold the aircraft on a true heading. On patrol for 3 hours, the wing was about to give up when suddenly the SL-11 was bathed in the light of a dozen searchlights on the ground. Armed with explosive and incendiary ammunition, the Brits drove toward the airship and came up under its nose, raking it with fire from bow to stern. Lieutenant William Leif Robinson was on his third pass when he noticed the airship began to glow. The event was visible for miles. Londoners who'd been the dying ship's target began to cheer. The blaze was also witnessed by a very different sentiment by Captain Ernst Lehmann, commander of the SL-11 sister ship, now scurrying for home.
I saw far behind us a bright ball of fire. Poor fellows, they were lost the moment the ship took fire. Zeppelin Captain Ernst Lehmann.
The Germans lost 4 ships and crews, including their best pilot, Captain Heinrich Mathy, who leaped to his death from his burning Zeppelin rather than being roasted alive. Leif Robinson was awarded the Victoria Cross for his victory, only to be killed the following year on the Western Front. The German High Command responded to this setback with a new type of airship that was bigger but lighter than the previous ones. These high climbers flew at over 16,000 feet, out of reach of ground fire and most aircraft. But if the crews could safely climb out of the reach of the enemy, they could not escape the deadly grip of Mother Nature. For hours on end, they endured freezing cold. The thin air made them nauseated, and the rapid change of pressure gave them the bends. But they inflicted minor damage on the British homeland. From the start of the war, the Germans had wanted to use heavier-than-air aircraft for strategic bombing, but lacked a suitable machine until the advent of the Gotha 2-engine bomber. The Gothas began raids on Britain in the summer of 1917 with impressive effect. Both the air defenses and the civilian population were unprepared for formations of bombers attacking in broad daylight. When 14 Gothas appeared over London for the first time on June 13, crowds of people ran into the streets to watch them. The bombs falling on them killed 162 people. The Gothas flew faster than the Zeppelins and were far harder to shoot down. When flying in formation, they could dish out heavy punishment to pursuing aircraft from their combined firepower. Because they could be produced much more quickly and cheaply than airships, they could be deployed in a far greater number. The largest airplanes to fly in the Great War were the heavy bombers. The most famous of these R planes was the Zeppelinstaaken R-6, introduced in 1917. These huge machines had 2 pilots sitting side by side. They also carried mechanics who tended the engines in flight. It took 40 men to prepare the Giant for its mission, loading bombs, filling the fuel tanks, and tuning the 4 250-horsepower engines. After a light supper, the 8-man crew would board the aircraft that was waiting for them with engines idling. With only calculations of time, speed, and direction to tell them where they were, the bombing wing would lumber toward its British target.
Inside the fuselage, the pale glow of dimmed lights outlined the chart table, the wireless equipment, and the instrument panel. Under us, a black abyss. Hauptmann Arthur Schuller.
Suddenly, in the night sky, they would see searchlights probing the sky, telling them they were at last over England. The bombers would fly straight ahead as their machine gunners tried to hit the lights below. Ahead, if they were lucky, would be a break in the clouds through which the pilot and observer could see the Thames River and the docks covered with the tools of war. The observer would move forward to the open post in the nose, from which it would release the bombs. With the release of the last bomb, they would turn for home. In the summer and fall of 1918, formations of Allied bombers began to fly raids deep into Germany. Predictably, bad weather and unreliable aircraft limited the effectiveness of the bomber offensive. But civilians in cities such as Frankfurt and Mannheim were taught the terror of air raids that had been experienced by inhabitants of Paris and London. The final assessment of World War I strategic bombing was not encouraging. At that stage of development, air power could not disrupt production nor weaken the population's will to fight. Bombing was costly and inaccurate. The building of large bombers was nonetheless an important step in the progress of aviation. Bomber crews had accumulated extensive experience in long-distance flight and night flying, and the large aircraft would be modified to carry passengers and freight. The strategic bombers of World War I paved the way for those who would follow. Germany launched its final offensive of the war on March 21, 1918. Using ground attack aircraft in support of the shock troops, the Germans were able to penetrate the Allied line in several places. Once again, the Kaiser's armies were driving on Paris. The air battles grew in fury to match the carnage on the ground. The Germans even sent their heavy Gotha bombers into the fight to attack key positions and supply dumps. With victory in sight, the German offensive ran out of gas, literally. By June, flying missions were cut back due to the lack of fuel. While the Allies were able to replace lost aircraft and men, the Imperial German Air Service was not. American flyers were now arriving in the thousands. In July, the Allies went on the offensive. The Germans were swamped in the air by this influx of manpower and industrial might. By the time of the Saint-Mihiel offensive in September, the Allies had complete control of the sky.
When the order came to prepare for battle, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes. There, armorers fused the bombs and loaded the rigs. Then the boys who had to take them up made sure the job was done right.
From only 500 aircraft on all fronts in 1914, air power had grown to the point where United States General Billy Mitchell commanded a force of 1,500 British, French, and American aircraft over a small sector of the Western Front.
It was the big push. When we lifted the flaps that September morning in 1918, everything was ready. For the dawn takeoffs, we put flares on our wingtips. Billy Mitchell had asked for every airplane that could fight, and we brought him out. All the Allied force on the continent gave its planes. General Mitchell called for 1,500, and we actually got 1,481 off the ground. Wooden props bit into the air, and the engines roared as we began to rev up. Our mission was to control the skies above the Saint-Mihiel sector. This was the First Army's field of battle. Some had orders to bomb and strafe enemy installations, others to engage the Germans in the air. This was it.
Each pilot had been carefully briefed for his part in the mission. U.S. aviators, in 609 American planes, now a solid part of the Allied air power, rose to attack. They supported troops on the ground, struck airfields, and shot up observation balloons, burning them out of the sky.
It was a slower, more personal kind of air war than we're used to now. Combatants could see each other's eyes, and when an aircraft headed down, its attacker could watch his foe struggle to escape. A pilot signaled that he had made another kill, and after a victory roll, he joined his buddies.
The German airmen, short of supplies and exhausted from too many missions, never gave up. In fact, they inflicted heavier losses than they suffered, but in the end, valor was not enough. On November 11, 1918, the Great War ended. The war cost an estimated 9 million lives. Of those, some 15,000 were airmen. Flight had lost its innocence.